Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Evan Rutter. I'm the Assistant Vice President for Alumni and Parent Engagement at CMC, also an alumnus of the college. And on behalf of CMC and the office, I hope you're well. Thanks for joining us today. I hope everything is going well, whether you're in the UK, the US, contiguous or not. We're thinking about you, we're thinking about our students, and we hope everyone's doing well, and we hope to see you all on campus as soon as humanly possible. The college is very excited to put together a series of robust virtual programs for you, everything from professor talks to health and well-being to wine tastings, and we even have a special guest from the Shedd Aquarium in Chicago to talk about sharks next week. So we hope you continue to follow our emails, follow us on Instagram at CMC Alumni and Families, and of course our private Facebook group, CMC Community, and learn more about the events and also engage with each other. So we're sending an email every Sunday, plus we're sending emails like you saw probably a couple of hours ago about these events. So hopefully you can join us for as many as possible. We look forward to seeing you here and at the many other events. Many alumni and parents have been asking how they can help during this time of crisis. I'm grateful to the incredibly supportive community that we have, our 13,500 alumni and our 5,000 current and active parents. So thanks for your well wishes. Our seniors who are scattered all over the world, who lost the last 8 weeks of their CMC experience. We're supposed to be graduating next Saturday, May 16th. We're sorry to miss them. I know some of them are on the call today. Professor Courser has taught many of them. And in honor of the class of 2020, we're doing a small campaign and asking anyone possible to donate 2020 to the Alumni Fund or the Parents Fund. So feel free to go on to cmc.edu/donate, make a gift, and put in the comment section in honor of the class of 2020. We hope to share with them all of your incredible support. A few things about Zoom before we move forward. I suggest putting on speaker view, which is on the top right. You can do speaker view or grid view. Speaker view means that I'm quite large right now and you can see me. Grid view means you can see 25 others. So if you do speaker view, it'll go to whomever is speaking. So me and then the professor, whoever may be asking a question later. So that's what I do recommend. At the bottom of the screen, there's something called chat as well as participants. If you click on the participants page, on the right, you'll pop up all the participants, including at the very bottom something that says raise hand. If you click on that raise hand during the Q&A portion, that means I will go to you and I will unmute you and I will call on you for a question. Zach Courser promises not to give any grades for your question, so you can ask whatever you'd like. In the chat feature, you can also submit a question there, but of course, as you see right now, please do tell us who you are, your affiliation with the college, and whether you're a parent, alumnus, alumna, and what year as well. So with that, I am very pleased to introduce a colleague, a friend, and a CMC professor, but most importantly, a CMC alumnus. Zach graduated in 1999 with a degree in government. He went on to get his Ph.D. from the University of Virginia, and currently not only does he teach government at CMC, but he is also the director of the policy lab here. So without further ado, Professor Courser, I hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Evan. Thanks for inviting me to give a talk. I have to say, it's an honor to address you all. I see now that we've got 106 participants. I really didn't know what to expect, and it just shows the deep commitment and involvement of our alumni in the life of the college. And you can see I'm broadcasting from my office. I think I'm maybe the only person on this broadcast who's actually at Claremont McKenna right now. I'm trying to make something of a statement that we are still open for business, and the semester has gone really well. We just finished up our policy lab class on Wednesday, and students are finishing up their final reports. And I have to say, you know, despite the difficulties, the students have done really well. And so, you know, despite the disruptions, we had a really good semester this semester. So I just wanted to tell you all that. And without too much further ado, let me give you just a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about. I tried to pick something that I was interested in and also was pretty topical and maybe useful for us thinking about how COVID's going to affect our elections moving forward to November. I think this is going to be a conversation, or at least it should be a conversation that's going to be happening in state capitals and in Washington, D.C. increasingly as we move towards November. And I want to talk about a few things. I want to talk a little bit about a history of U.S. elections during times of crisis, to give us a little context for judging our own political moment. I want to talk a little bit about constitutional law and federal law around elections to help us contextualize and understand what it is exactly Congress can do, who's in charge, and how federalism works to define elections law. I want to talk about some of the disruptions that have already happened to our elections, which I think will give us some valuable information in terms of thinking about what could actually happen in November. Right now, there's been a couple of tough elections. I'll talk about that, but I think they have lessons for us for November about not only about what to do, but what not to do. And then I want to talk about some recommendations that have been put out about what Congress and states and local officials can do to prepare for November. So I'm going to talk about 30 minutes or so, and I'm going to try to leave 20 minutes or so for questions. So with that, I think let's test my Zoom skills. I've had to use them a lot lately. Here's my presentation. Hopefully that's up on the screen. You guys can see that. So as Evan mentioned, I'm co-director of the CMC Policy Lab. I co-direct it together with Eric Helland, who's in the Department of Economics. Just a little plug for the Policy Lab. Policy Lab is it's both a class that we teach every semester, but it's also an ongoing research project that Eric and I run. That includes our students in real-world policy research. The concept of Policy Lab is we're not only teaching skills like, being good social science researchers, teaching them skills about statistics and giving them context for understanding our political process, but we actually have them work directly with partners in Washington, D.C. on real world projects. We've got 3 projects going right now. I'm responsible right now for a project on congressional earmarking reform. Students just turned in a memo for that. So if you're interested to learn more about what's happening at CMC and policy education, check out our website, policylab.cmc.edu. So American elections in times of turmoil. This isn't our first time at the rodeo. We've had some really difficult elections in the past. In fact, I would say circumstances have been much more dire than they are right now. And I want to talk about how Americans dealt with that situation and talk a little bit about the politics surrounding thoughts about, for instance, postponing elections and ultimately what was done during these elections and how it affected turnout. So first election I wanted to talk about is the election of the presidential election of 1812. You can see it was a pretty tough time. That's the White House on fire. That was 1814, a couple of years after the election. Maybe some people regretted voting for Madison. But nonetheless, what's interesting about the election of 1812 is it took place during hostilities in the War of 1812. The war had not yet moved into America. At this point, Americans were still attempting to conquer Canada without much success. But despite the disruptions of trying to engage in a war, President Madison was reelected with 58% of the electoral vote. And, things went fine. Although one important point to mention is that at this time, only half the states held popular elections for president. The Constitution still allows for, and I want you guys to remember that as we move forward, the Constitution still allows for state legislatures to elect their electors to decide who they'd like to be president. It's not an obligation under the Constitution that states hold a plebiscite amongst voters in order to select the president. At this time, there was a growing movement for states to actually hold elections. But as you can see, we're only about halfway there. But it's just important to remember that, again, when we think about disrupted elections or the possibilities of what could happen, there is the possibility that legally and under the Constitution, you can have state legislatures decide who the president will be rather than actually having to hold a popular election. One election that was much more grave than 1812 was 1864, of course. This was the re-election campaign of President Lincoln. And of course, this campaign was taking place in the midst of war. And when I say the midst of war, I really do mean in the midst. That is to say, the South was in open rebellion. Certain states were under occupation. There was, a lot of disruption in terms of people's understanding of law and politics at the time. But despite all of this disruption, despite the fact that America was at war and that one could at least begin to make an argument that this was so unprecedented and disruptive that we should think at least about postponing the election, that the historical record shows that there really only muted calls for postponement. In some quarters, there was talk of maybe delaying the election, but they were never really seriously heard. In fact, what happened was there was preparations made, particularly to think about soldiers who would be absent from the North and either in occupied territory or occupied states or fighting the Confederacy. And so measures were taken to allow soldiers to vote absentee in states that actually allowed it. And if you were from a state that didn't allow it, then you were allowed a furlough to travel home to vote. And this was obviously to make sure that soldiers, Union soldiers who overwhelmingly favored Lincoln would have an opportunity to travel home and vote. And so Lincoln was reelected with 55% of the popular vote. And turnout was, for the 19th century, maybe not extraordinary. It was somewhat depressed by those standards, and we have to think about lots of exceptions to counting turnout. But 74% in the states that were able to vote for president in 1864 turned out to vote. So in the end, it actually turned out rather well. And if anything, I think this election stands out as a proud moment in American history where despite civil war, despite the occupation of certain areas of the country and open insurrection of states, we still managed to have a presidential election. I think it still speaks well of American democracy. Now, let's talk about the midterm election of 1918. Now, this is more analogous to the situation that we're going through right now. And we've all obviously probably either through newspaper articles or through Googling or through picking up a book have been trying to understand how our own pandemic right now compares to what was called the Spanish flu, the pandemic of 1918. And it's an interesting case for us because it's not a presidential election, it's a midterm election, but the circumstances were much worse in 1918. I'll talk a little bit about the scale of deaths and the disruption that was happening to the country at that time, and how much the election overlapped with really the worst part of the pandemic, or at least the second wave of the pandemic. But there are many things similar in terms of the reactions that people had in terms of, it was largely a local effort, state and local officials, to decide what to do in terms of social distancing, in terms of banning public gatherings, in terms of deciding essentially what could be done in public to try to prevent the transmission of the flu at this time. So there was a pastiche of different regulations and laws. Maybe an interesting example might be San Francisco, which mandated wearing masks during certain parts of the pandemic, which proved somewhat controversial. But there were a variety of different measures taken. They varied by locality, but nonetheless, they were pretty similar to what we're seeing now. So this put a real crimp in elections, like they're putting a crimp in our elections right now. I don't know if you guys have been following. I mean, obviously Donald Trump is seeing his press conferences and his ability to communicate through the press as an opportunity to campaign, and his question and answer sessions and updates about the pandemic have taken on a certain campaign flair, some would say. But Joe Biden, he's pretty much reporting from the basement of his home in Delaware, and he's actually now starting to try to do some other creative events. His wife is out right now doing virtual events. Biden is doing virtual events with different interest groups and with different representatives of different states. We're sort of experiencing right now a transition where candidates are trying to figure out what is it like to campaign at a time where you can't really shake hands and kiss babies. And this was the same thing in 1918. Candidates had to become a little bit creative. They obviously lacked the internet, but there was a lot of direct mail. There were newspaper ads. There was people tried to innovate and come up with ways in which, if you were a candidate, you could sort of socially distance yourself, but nonetheless communicate with voters. Like 1864, there was little talk of postponement of the 1918 election. Probably a lot of that had to do with the fact that America was in the midst of a world war at this time. This was very controversial at the moment. It was a really important election for President Wilson. to ratify his handling of World War I and his decision to enter World War I. So there was a strong feeling that there was so much at stake that it was really, it would be really bad for American foreign policy and American politics if we really talked about postponement. And I think also there was a general patriotic feeling that there's a connection between doing one's duty as a citizen and voting, and despite what was a dangerous pandemic. But nonetheless, just outright illness, that means people being very sick and unable to go to polling places, or different kinds of social distancing efforts in localities that altered typical voting patterns, either through closing certain polling places or opening others. It did have an effect on turnout. But sort of, again, I think in context, and I'll talk about just in a second, just how grave the crisis was, turnout was still fairly decent. 40% of Americans turned out in 1918. It was only down 10% from the last midterm election in 1916. And if you look in newspapers, I took out a couple of old newspaper articles here to sort of give you a sense of like local journalism and what localities were doing. People played politics with the quarantine in 1918 just as much as we see the attempts at playing politics with the quarantine today. There were accusations that Republicans or Democrats were trying to use local regulations to depress voting or discourage voting. There were rumors that ran rampant about if the election had been canceled or delayed. But newspapers were communicating that people should go vote. There wasn't a notion that you should forego your civic duty even during the depths of a pandemic. So here's an article from Wisconsin saying that there were rumors circulating that the State Board of Health was going to stop the election and it's business as usual. And here's an article from just around the election day, before election day, from Monterey, California, essentially asking that people wear masks when they go to vote to prevent transmission. It's important to remember too, as I go to this next slide here, at this point, this was the darkest moment in the pandemic. In 1918, in October, November, September, that range, this is where we experienced the most deaths from the pandemic in the United States and around the world. This is a very old graph, and I apologize if it's hard to read, but it's kind of interesting and useful as a historical document. I don't really stand up for its accuracy, but I think it explains what was happening during these months. The dark line that is the tallest represents deaths per 1,000 in the city of New York. And you can see that the peak occurred essentially about the 3rd into the 4th week of October of 1918. And I've drawn a red line to show you where election day actually was. If you want to get really specific about deaths, and it's really hard to do so, there's a lot of articles that have been put out where people have tried to piece together exactly how many people died, where, and when during the pandemic, and it's really hard to do. Despite the fact there are death records, there's a lot of obstacles to try to really disaggregate what was happening in terms of who was dying of the influenza, where they were dying, and to get an accurate count. So everything we talk about is mostly estimates, but you can see the scale of this, particularly compared to the population of the United States at this time, was really frightening. And it was happening around the world. In London, Paris, Berlin, they were experiencing similar deaths, or a similar death rate, I should say. As we headed into the election in 1918, New York, Philadelphia, and other large eastern cities were actually experiencing a decline. They were just off the peak. And as we reached election day, some cities had actually stopped social distancing measures, both in reaction to the drop in deaths, but also out of a concern for allowing people to vote. In the West, it was just gearing up. I don't have a neat graph like this to show you California during this period, but California was particularly dire at this moment. And a lot of polling places were closed basically because no one could run them because everyone was sick. So the majority of deaths actually occurred in the fall of 1918, which is during the election, to give you a little context about how impressive it was that the election went on. If you compare the number of deaths to the total deaths, the CDC estimates that almost 700,000 people died during the influenza pandemic over the entire period of the pandemic. As we know, it comes in waves. But this wave that happened in October was the deadliest. Almost 200,000 people died. So just again, the scale of human misery, the fear, the number of deaths were remarkable. But despite it all, the election went on, and really there was only about a 10% dip in turnout. So I want to talk a little bit now about elections and the Constitution to try to understand what it is exactly Congress or the president can do in times of crisis to either postpone, delay, or otherwise change when elections can be held. So there are two primary clauses in the Constitution that describe the regulation or Congress's right to regulate federal elections. And what's called the Elections Clause in Article 1, Section 4 says that times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. But the Congress may, at any time by law, make or alter such regulations except as to places of choosing senators. So one of the reasons I highlighted this word legislature is because this could become ticklish later on in terms of how the Supreme Court has interpreted exactly what legislature means. Does it mean the House and the Senate of a particular state? Does it mean an initiative or any kind of popular referenda? Does it mean the executive? Does it mean a combination thereof? The court has weighed in on these ideas in different ways, and I won't get into the finery of the determinations they've made. But I think it's something to keep your eye on as we continue to talk about this, in the sense that if things really get disrupted, there will likely be a role for the Supreme Court to make some determinations about what states can do if, for whatever reason, there's some determination made that an election cannot be held. And deciding who is the legislature will be really important, because in certain states there are governors that are Democrats and governors that are Republicans in battleground states, and legislatures that don't necessarily line up with the governor. And there could be some really nasty political battles in states like Michigan, Florida, over whether or not to actually hold an election or whether or not to throw it to the legislature to decide who the electors will be. And this is only, of course, talking about the presidential election, which is regulated under Article 2, Section 1. The Congress may determine the time of choosing the electors and the day which they shall give their votes, which day shall be the same throughout the United States. So Congress has passed a number of laws under its power in the Constitution. But the Constitution has just one more thing to say about this. What's interesting about both these sections, if I was teaching a class right now, I'd say, okay, everybody, now what's missing from this? And since I don't have the opportunity to do that, I'll just tell you, it doesn't actually list a date. It doesn't say that this election has to take place at any particular time. However, the 20th Amendment, which was ratified much later in the 1950s, does actually list a date. In fact, this is the only date about elections that exists in the Constitution. It says the terms of the president and the vice president shall end at noon on the 20th day of January, and the terms of senators and representatives at noon on the 3rd day of January. So the Constitution does set a deadline, and it does set an end to terms of office for the president and for congresspeople. And so, if you want to think about a hard deadline, these come as close as we have to those hard deadlines. So what's Congress's election timeline? Well, so Congress has to pass laws based on its constitutional power to essentially set a timeline for the election of a president and for their own elections. So current federal law requires, if you want to think about deadlines, if you want to think, we already know the date of the 2020 election when people have to show up and cast their votes. But beyond that, there's still a process that has to occur, and Congress sets out what those dates are. These dates could become important if there is some kind of delay. I mean, for those of us, it sounds funny for me to say stuff like this, but I'm around 18-year-olds a lot, so I'm going to go ahead and say it. Do you remember back to 2000? I do, and you might remember that waiting on Florida took a very long time, and people were starting to worry about these dates in particular. As we sort of ran into Congress's statutory deadlines and maybe even closer into the constitutional deadlines, it became more and more urgent to come to a conclusion about what Florida's electors were actually saying. Who were they going to vote for? Was it going to be Bush or Gore? And we know in the end, it was up to the Supreme Court in the case Bush v. Gore that it was decided that Bush would prevail. But these deadlines, you might remember in 2000, were on people's minds. And they may become to be on people's minds this go around. I hope not, but that's why I want you to keep them in mind. So on December 14th, electors meet to vote. On December 23rd, just before Christmas, the states send their electoral votes to Congress. And then just a few days after the new Congress is seated, the electoral votes are received by Congress and counted in a joint session. So this is the timeline that they've set up for themselves. And I've got a quote here from an article that I recommend for a good summary of whether or not the Constitution allows for a delay in presidential elections. Scott Bomboy at the National Constitution Center writes that Congress has the power by changing the appropriate statutes to change the general election date as well as the dates of electoral votes are received in Washington and counted in Congress. So they can fudge with these dates, but again, there's still some pretty hard and fast deadlines that are coming up in terms of terms ending and the necessity to seat a new Congress, a newly elected Congress, and a newly elected president. So again, talking about Congress's election laws, if we want to talk about plans that Congress has made for disruptions, they really haven't made too many disruptions or made contingencies or plans for disrupted elections. Federal law generally does not make accommodations or plans for disruptions because typically these kinds of decisions are made at the state and local level. Generally speaking, states are in charge of conducting elections. Congress may set this timeline. They may seek uniformity in terms of setting a general election date, but in terms of how these elections actually take place, it's up to states to decide these sorts of things. So the federal government really hasn't weighed in on what we should do during disruptions. So provisions in legislation that are devoted for options like mail-in voting, which you've heard a lot about, remote voting, early voting, voter registration. These are things that Congress could potentially weigh in on. They just haven't. But we should think about them as like sort of tools in the toolbox. They're certainly allowed. They're things that Congress can do to try to set plans and try to help states in terms of dealing with the consequences for disrupted elections, but they really haven't done so thus far. So here's, so the so what question. Why do we care? Why is this such an important topic? Well, I mean, getting beyond the sort of patriotic question that was sort of raised early on in terms of American history about the primacy of the vote and how much holding and having an election is maybe, if not, not the most important and the most essential feature of our American democracy. Holding fast to having an election and allowing everyone to vote, is the quintessence of what American democracy means. So we should all be very concerned about anything that should threaten either voting integrity, the date of elections, or things that may tend to prevent people from exercising their right to vote. And these vary from maybe minor considerations in terms of the modes of voting to major considerations such as canceling elections. But there's already been, I'm going to talk about two elections in particular that I think represent some of the dangers that could lie ahead for us as we head to November if we don't start to now, as states and as the federal government, make plans for potential disruptions. Because as I was talking about earlier, oftentimes pandemics come in waves. Now, I'm not an epidemiologist. I attend Twitter University every morning. And I look at all the news articles and the graphs, and I look at what Nate Silver has to say. He's not an epidemiologist either, but he sure talks a lot about what's happening with the virus. And I'm just as confused as the next person about what to expect. But I do know, looking back at the history of pandemics like the Spanish flu, they come in waves. And it is certainly possible as we look forward to November that there could be a second wave. And if we don't make plans for it, it could cause some major disruptions or cancellations to the election. And so I want to talk about a couple things. I want to talk about the example of Ohio's March election, and I also want to talk about Wisconsin, because these are two elections that I think represent, sort of what could happen, the sort of what if questions about if we don't prepare now, what could happen. So Ohio had a March election whose timing was really unfortunate. You'll remember, for those of you who are here in California, that California had its primary in early March and escaped the acceleration of the pandemic and the closing of public places and social distancing laws and the safer at home order. We managed to sort of get the election in just under the wire. But from, after March 3rd, in the next 2 weeks, those weeks were extremely critical to stop the spread of COVID-19. And Ohio's election was running smack dab into this effort to try to protect public health and safety. And so there was a bit of a confusion because nobody really knew who was in charge. Nobody really knew how an election could be stopped or postponed. And there was also a kind of urgency to decide at the last minute whether or not the election would go forward or whether it would be stopped in the interest of public health. And so confusion became a real problem in the Ohio primary. Elections officials initially attempted to cancel in-person voting. And I don't want to get into too much of the fineries of this argument because there's a lot of stuff that was going on. There was a lot of confusion. Many people in Ohio called it a constitutional crisis because it seemed as though the governor was stepping in and using authority that he didn't have under the state constitution and usurping the legislature's power to make decisions about elections. Ultimately, there were two courses that were attempted. One was a straight out course to say that there was something that could actually be done to alter the election. That is to say, to change the date of the election, to sort of commandeer when the election would be and the terms in which the election would take place. That was overturned by a county judge. They basically said the governor and health officials did not have the right to alter the election. What ultimately happened, though, is that the state Supreme Court upheld that the Ohio health director could close polling places, which in effect closed the election. This happened over the space of a weekend. It was very chaotic. Voters were very confused. Ultimately, the legislature afterwards created a mostly absentee election. When I say mostly absentee, they created some exceptions for in-person voting, but mostly it was done by absentee ballot. And they allowed ballots to go out, or rather to be returned until April 28th. And they did a number of things, like they mailed postcards to voters saying that they could request an absentee ballot. They tried to educate people as best they could. But it was a bit of a hash, to be honest with you. The other thing that was important about this March 17th date was even though it doesn't seem like now, back then, it was still a big question who's going to be the nominee for the Democratic Party. Was it going to be Joe Biden? Was it going to be Bernie Sanders? Ohio was considered a really important part of that. And that whole message that Ohio could have been put out there in terms of their preference for Democratic nominee, that was very much muted by this whole situation. And so I've got a little graph to the side here to give you some context about turnout, like how this actually affected turnout. If you look at this shows all types of elections for Ohio, but if you look, for example, at presidential primaries, for example, the 2008 presidential primary in Ohio, they had 42% turnout. If you look at 2016, 38%. And if you go down to 2020, it's just 20% turnout. So this really, there's a combination of factors here. It wasn't just the postponement of the election and the turn to absentee ballots that affected this. There might be something also to be said for the fact that there really wasn't much going on that was competitive anymore in the presidential election. But nonetheless, Ohio voters seem very much deprived of an election in March of this year. What does this tell us about November 2020? Well, it tells us that we need to work these things out ahead of time. Having plans, having Congress step in and talk about disruption, having states have plans, clear authority being defined and having contingency plans in place will be very important, so there's not these kinds of scrambles happening at the last minute where no one's exactly sure what's going to happen and who's in charge. Another example of disruptions is Wisconsin's April election. Now, there's a lot going on here, and I'm sure a lot of you followed this already. But Wisconsin had an April election, which was gave the legislature and governor a little more time than had Ohio to come up with a plan for their election. And they had more than a primary election going on. They also had a key Supreme Court race on the ballot. And Wisconsin has a tradition of spring elections where there are several local elections on the ballot. So this wasn't a sort of, dog and pony show about presidential selection, sort of after the fact. It was really important in terms of not disrupting the local politics and not disrupting the Supreme Court in Wisconsin. So the governor of Wisconsin, who happens to be a Democrat, he did try for a number of different changes to the process, the elections process. He tried to reschedule the election. He tried to think about mail-in voting, but this quickly descended into a political brouhaha. Republicans battled back in the state legislature. They went to court. They managed to block the governor's order that was postponing the primary. And as a consequence, in a sort of last-minute scramble to try to figure out how an in-person election would actually take place, it had a real effect on people's abilities to vote. In particular, you see this line here with this person holding the sign that said, "This is ridiculous." In Milwaukee, the number of polling stations went from 180 down to 5. And so people really had to stick it out in order to express themselves and have their votes heard in April by really standing these super long lines because of the very, very few polling stations that were open in Milwaukee. There was also an attempt to try to extend the deadline for counting absentee ballots. And this was appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court overruled the lower court and basically said you couldn't extend the deadlines. Basically, they said you couldn't alter the election under the terms that were set earlier. You all might also remember, too, that this sort of began a political discussion about mail-in ballots. President Trump weighed in, said that mail ballots are very dangerous for this country because of cheaters. They go collect them. They are fraudulent in many cases. And some states reacted to this. There's been a push to try to get states to have no reason absentee voting. There are certain states like Washington and Oregon that have all mail-in elections. There are states like California where if you want to be an absentee voter, you can request. You don't have to have a reason rather. And then there are states like Texas and Louisiana where you have to have a reason that you can't be at the polling place. And there's been some moves to try to get those states to loosen those laws. But President Trump and Republican states have been moving against mail-in ballots and moving against expansions in mail-in ballots, either out of fear of cheating or out of a perceived political advantage. Although it's kind of interesting to mention the outcome of this election. The turnout, despite all of these difficulties in Milwaukee and the disruption heading up to the election, turnout was fairly comparable to the spring election in 2008. It was depressed, but it wasn't as bad as Ohio's turnout. The other thing is this this key Supreme Court race, even though it's putatively a nonpartisan race, the Democrat won that race. And so despite all the attempts by Republicans who thought by depressing turnout in Milwaukee, they could advantage themselves in this race, they didn't actually do so. Turnout was actually pretty consistent. And as a matter of fact, the election did go to the more Democratic candidate for the state Supreme Court. One more thing I want to say is in terms of how much fraud is there out there? Now this isn't, you can't measure fraud in the abstract, right? There has to be a prosecution. That is to say a prosecutor has deemed that fraud took place and has decided to go ahead and press charges. But under those parameters, there have only been 491 cases of mail-in fraud prosecutions in all US elections between 2000 and 2012. So it's not a very common happening or occurrence. So disruptions continue to happen. Even though the Democratic primary seems to be resolved, there are several states that have pushed back their presidential primaries. I've listed them here. New York's gone as far as to essentially cancel its presidential primary because they're like, what's the point? It's a foregone conclusion. Why should we have a primary? But this is still sort of up in the air. State officials are going to appeal a decision where a federal judge has ordered them to go ahead and hold their election in June, despite the fact that they don't think it's important, it's a waste of money, it's a waste of time. There's still some jiggering and back and forthing going on between states and parties and the courts about how far states can go in changing or altering their primaries. And the New York case will be instructive about whether or not they can sort of outright cancel them. Last thing I want to talk about is some recent works. If you're interested in learning more about what we could expect in November, to learn about elections laws, to learn about things that Congress and states can do to prevent an election meltdown in 2020, I'd commend a couple of things to you. One is a new book by Richard Hassan, who's a professor at the University of California at Irvine. He published this book, Timing is Everything, that is really just about this topic. It's not specifically about the pandemic, but it is about the overall subject of disruption and elections. He's also been at work, that is to say Hassan has, at talking about exactly how fairness and legitimacy can be preserved in the November 2020 election. He put together an ad hoc committee, and they've come out with some recommendations about things that can be done before November to try to prevent some kind of disruption. And if you want to look at both of those, I've outlined some of their ideas. They seem fairly common sense. I've just excerpted a few of them here. We could talk about them later if you'd like to. But I mean, I think generally the message is that we need to plan, and you need to think ahead, and we need to be sure that, we all hope there will not be a second wave. We will all hope that elections will take place as normal in November. But if they don't, we should be prepared and think about ways in which we can make sure that we preserve American democracy, that we preserve the legitimacy of our democracy and our elections by making sure that elections can take place. And I think there's several easy things that we could do to make that happen. So I'll stop there. We've got about 15 minutes left for any questions you may have. So thanks for your attention.
All right, thank you very much, Zach. Really appreciate, Professor Courser, really appreciate all of that. We have a couple questions in the chat. We also have someone who raised their hand, so I'll turn it over for Richard Mancuso.
Thanks, Evan, and thanks, Professor Courser, for the really informative presentation. As I think you know, a lot of CMCers are biased to action and want to take action when they hear about a problem that exists in the world, in the United States, et cetera. So my question is, what should we do with the information that you shared with us today? How should we, go about urging governments at varying levels to help or to take the steps necessary to prepare for, a second wave and a downside case, that comes along with that second wave, and, taking steps to ensure that it doesn't affect the elections in November?
It's a great question. And I think, in terms of what we can do as citizens, there's a couple of things. One is making this more of a topic in Congress. Congress, there's an agenda, right? And it's driven by this crisis. And oftentimes we're reacting to things like the tremendous unemployment that's occurring right now, and the meltdown in the stock market, and the death toll that's happening. And we get stuck in the moment, and it's hard to make plans at moments of crisis like this. But I think we should be talking about, we should try to shift the conversation in Congress to also be thinking about our elections and the integrity of our elections. If we want to think about, what is the next relief package going to look like, we should say that elections are just as important and critical a part of that as, say, unemployment, and that we need to make sure that'll happen. The other thing I would say quickly is that, all politics is local, and part of this presentation talked about the fact that it's going to, in terms of the conduct of these elections, it's going to be a lot of county clerks around this country that are really going to be the heroes, or can be the heroes, of making sure that this election works. here in Los Angeles County, we're making plans, and I think plans have already been made to go to an all-male election in November, or at least preparations are being made for being able to do so. This requires a lot of money and a lot of planning, and if there's not pressure put on county commissioners and elected officials, and if clerks are not engaged in this question, they're going to be caught flat-footed come November. They may lack resources, but I think it's something that they should all be planning for. So advocating to you, even just to your local county clerk, I think can make a difference.
All right, I'm going to go to the chat for a question and then back to Art Dodd, who raised his hand. So first question was about President Trump refusing to allow his staff to testify before Congress and honor subpoenas and whatnot. And the question is, can we still call this a democracy when we can't hold our leaders accountable? And this person noted that the GOP continues to disenfranchise voters and make voting as difficult as possible. So kind of how can we still call this a democracy?
Well, I mean, it's interesting, how it's amazing what a year 2020 has been. It's almost easy to forget there was an impeachment that took place. And I think that, in the impeachment, as satisfying or unsatisfying as that might have been, I think that really was the moment or opportunity to attempt to hold the president accountable for actions like you were describing. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on which side of the aisle you're on, the president didn't come very close to being impeached. And that resolved itself just about the time that the pandemic picked up. So I don't think between now and November, we're going to hear any more about the notion of, the legitimacy of the president. I think Trump is certainly there. There's no doubt about that. Can we call this an American democracy? Well, I would say that, again, and I've sort of reiterated this theme several times, if we have that election in November, if it's free, if it's fair, and if it's open, despite whatever pandemic or crisis is occurring, I think that we can be confident that, yes, indeed, there is still something to be said for an American democracy. Because let's not forget, although it was close, and although it was not determined by the popular vote, it was determined by the Constitution, Trump was elected legally under our laws. And a lot of the work that we have to do as individual citizens, if we disagree with the president and his actions, is to take to the polls, talk to our friends and neighbors, to organize and to speak out. And that's what's going to make change.
All right, we're going to go to Art Dodd, who raised his hand. Art, you are unmuted if you'd like to go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. So Zachary, expand your comments regarding state and local budgets and the incredible pressure they're going to be under to come up with more money to a given area, which may be more of even a more drastic, draconian zero-sum game for them.
Yeah, I'm involved in local Claremont politics here, and Claremont was in a budget crisis already, and things have only, of course, gotten worse because in California, a lot of revenue that localities depend on has to do with sales tax, and the sales tax is very depressed right now. And one of the conversations that's going on in Congress right now between Democrats and Republicans is there going to be some kind of relief for state and local government? And it would go, and in thinking about that, a lot of that discussion that I've read about has been taking place in terms of public safety, in terms of like sanitation, the sort of local kinds of services that we depend on, and that a bailout is necessary in order to preserve those kinds of services. We should also think about the fact that elections are a critical part of local government, and that if we can empower local governments to adequately respond to crises, I think that's another strong reason why Congress should be considering some kind of relief for state and local governments, because I think you can draw a straight line between their budgets and their ability to conduct elections.
All right, next question. How do we promote truthful information nowadays with so much false info online and in the media? How can people be sure they are getting the real truth?
Ooh, yeah, you tell me. I was joking earlier that I attend Twitter University. I'm as guilty as anybody of sort of plowing through headlines and commentary in this sort of like wild west of information that we live in these days. It seems like the traditional gatekeepers for information are challenged these days. It's hard to know who's right and who's wrong. I mean, the best I could tell you is do what I do, in the sense that I try to keep an open mind, and I don't always take everyone's word for it. And it's a very disorienting kind of person to be, in the sense that it's not as easy as just figuring out what one person or one party has to say about any particular political idea. But I think if you try to do some homework and try to understand, try to make a judgment for yourself. I think one of the dangers that we run into with how media has changed in the internet age is the velocity of information and the lack of ability we have to digest it. And we're not going to slow anything down. Things just keep speeding up. Whether it's an impeachment or the COVID crisis or changes to the financial markets, we're all subject to a very new reality where life moves very fast. But whether the truth or falsity of anything, I guess what I do is I try not to make up my mind too quickly. I try not to react all the time, not only because it's exhausting, but because it rarely leads you in the right direction.
Thank you. Next question. It's about Oregon. So Oregon and some other places. Oregon's allowed vote by mail since 1980 and went all vote by mail about 2 decades ago. Places like Estonia that have issues frequently with Russia has had internet voting since 2005, and 44% of voters vote using iVoting. Why can we not offer vote by mail and electronic voting here?
Well, the easier question is electronic voting, and I think it's because there's a real reluctance and a concern, I think a genuine concern about elections integrity by having votes to the internet, even electronically. One of the recommendations of this UCI panel about the 2020 elections was that votes should be conducted with a paper record, that there should be some kind of ballot, some kind of physical thing that could be counted and preserved. Because there's a lot of, I think, legitimate worry about how elections can be manipulated or changed, or how the record can be manipulated or changed if it's all electronic. Now, I'm sure you've probably got some good answers, and other people have as well, about accommodations or things that can be done to preserve those elections. I'm not familiar with Estonia's track record on this, but it might be a good one. But I would say here politically in the United States, there's grave concern about opening up our elections to a sort of fully internet election. Now, on mail-in ballots, that's harder because, again, it's been Washington and Oregon have been early adopters of an mail-in ballot, but there are arguments that are being made. I know they were made here in LA County in talking about closing polling places, or the potential for closing polling places, in that it does disadvantage certain types of voters, either voters who simply prefer to do this in person, but people who have certain kinds of limitations. I'm trying to think of the short list that I heard. I know the arguments out there, but I think there are some reasonable arguments about why there at least should be some opportunities for, say, even voting centers if there weren't polling places. But we can also see the positive effects of having mail-in balloting in terms of ease, in terms of driving up voter turnout. And I think, but I do think, like talking about this election, an important thing to remember is that we have to educate and acclimate voters to changes in the ways in which we conduct elections. And so it's really important to think like, is mail-in balloting really the matter of flipping a switch? Sort of. But there's a lot of people who maybe for the entirety of their lives, they have only gone to a polling place. And so there's a lot of education that has to take place to acclimate and educate people to different ways of expressing their vote.
So a quick follow-up to that, since we talked about mail-in voting. Professor Courser, what do you think we can learn from the all-mail ballot counties in California? I think what we can learn is that there's a difference of opinion based on localities in California, and California has sort of started a pilot program for all mail-in balloting. So certain counties can have all mail ballots, others can't. There's been a move to sort of make this every county have a mail-in ballot. But I think
I think what it represents is that California was on its way to being like Washington and Oregon. I think they were on their way to sort of having a pilot program to prove that this could work here. But I do think it's partial. We're not all the way there yet, but I do think it's positive, and I do think it's given larger counties in the state the opportunity to gear up for a potentially having an all mail-in election in November.
All right. Next question. Do you have any examples of voter suppression? And if so, how would you recommend citizens fight those efforts?
Well, I mean, I just draw us back, because we've only got a couple minutes left. I just draw us back to what I talked about in terms of how a lack of planning or an insistence on holding in-person elections can really negatively impact particularly urban areas. The example, I think, of Milwaukee is probably prime in my mind in terms of what the consequences are. When you close, virtually all polling places and you make it difficult for people to access a mail-in ballot, when you think about the demographics of Milwaukee, compared to the rest of Wisconsin, it's much more of a minority population, and therefore altering the way that the election is conducted there is going to suppress minority turnout. So all these things that I'm talking about in terms of making plans and preparations for allowing elections to take place, I think they would go a long way towards the consequences of a lack of planning of voter suppression, which I think was at least a strong possibility and certainly occurred to a degree in Milwaukee.
All right, thank you, Professor Courser. So it is 3 o'clock. That is our committed time. I know you have dinner or other work engagements. So if you need to sign off now, go ahead and do so. Professor Courser has agreed to stay on for a few more minutes to answer some more questions. So I'm going to keep going for a little bit. We'll go about 5 or 10 more minutes, so you're welcome to stay. Otherwise, thank you, and we hope to see you at our future events. Next week, we do have the Shed Aquarium with a shark biologist, which should be fascinating, as well as Professor Jenny Taw from our International Relations Department. So continue to stay tuned to our email communications, and do please consider making a gift in honor of our class of 2020. And so I will go on to the next question. Professor Courser, if a pandemic wave near the election somehow necessitates massive mail-in balloting, as had happened in Ohio, will the Republican Party automatically contest its results if it does not re-elect Trump?
Oh, Well, I mean, look, I think the Trump has, in his business dealing has a history of being litigious. So I don't think there's any limitation in terms of the imagination of what kinds of court cases could be brought in attempt to try to delegitimize a rapid shift towards absentee voting. And I think you're right to point out what happened in Ohio as being very unclear in terms of who's in charge, and then also the effects of what happened in Ohio in depressing turnout. There's a lot that could be litigated there, or rather not, litigated. Not that makes sense. I need another cup of coffee. Would Trump sue? It's probably likely, but I think at the end of the election, there will be tremendous pressures like they were in 2000 for whatever doubts about the election to get wrapped up in a hurry. And I think that would weigh heavily against any kind of protracted arguments that Trump or Republicans could make about the legitimacy of the ballot box. And in fact, there's two things that could happen that would make the outcome more expeditious. One, as I mentioned earlier, certain state legislatures could simply elect to hold their own elections and decide on their own electors, which would have severe political consequences, which would weigh against that happening, but it's a possibility. The other is that the Supreme Court would weigh in yet again in a Trump versus Biden, and that they in one fell swoop would sort of come in as like a deus ex machina again and solve all these problems. Then it's up to Americans' interpretation of how legitimate or illegitimate it was, but we need decisiveness at those moments.
So this is a question for you, Professor Courser, really that deals with your informed opinion. Do you think election 2020 will indeed be free, fair, and open?
I think so, but my strong caveat is that I think there's a lot of happy talk that's going on right now about the pandemic, and I understand why. I'm getting tired of being all cooped up and having nobody on campus and having to order my groceries via Instacart and all the rest of it. But at the same time, getting back to who to believe, I don't know who to believe about this pandemic. I don't know where it's going. And I do think looking at the historical record and what little I understand well about, how that matches up against our current crisis, I think we run a danger of allowing this happy talk into lulling us into a false sense of security about what can happen in November. There could be a lot of, this has become, this pandemic has become so politicized. I could easily see, any talk about trying to take advanced measures ahead of the November election as being politicized between Republicans and Democrats, and that either it would end in inaction or that people would become convinced that we don't really have to worry about this. And I talked already about how difficult it is to lead and govern in a time of crisis. And it's really tough to plan. And so November seems years from now, but it's not. And if we want to make sure that the election goes off without a hitch, we need to start planning yesterday.
Next question. There appears to be a belief that these type of catastrophic crises favor the incumbent, somewhat of a don't change horses in midstream situation. Do you believe that is true?
I haven't done a systematic study of this to really tell you, but I mean, just looking back at the historical record, particularly in times of war, I think there's a reason why Franklin Delano Roosevelt managed to get elected 4 times to the office of president. It had to do with the Great Depression and the enormous economic disruptions that it brought with it, and then of course to World War II. But it's not to say always. Going back to the 1918 election, the midterm election, actually, Woodrow Wilson actually lost votes in Congress, and it became much harder for him to get the ratification for the League of Nations, which he considered really the most important thing other than America's conduct during World War I. He was denied that. And so, Americans don't necessarily stay the course. Things can go other directions. So, history can be somewhat of a guide here, but I don't think it's dispositive that, it's going to be an incumbent advantage.
Next question. If Trump were to lose but refuse to leave office, what options would we have?
Well, I think it would probably be something like the Marines escorting him out the front door. I don't really think there's a legal leg to stand on. There might be an attempt to have a political leg to stand on, but it's hard to imagine that taking place in any kind of normal legal circumstance. The Constitution is very clear when the president's term ends, and if there's an election that shows that Trump has lost, he may insist that he didn't, but I think it becomes, even for him, who can spin almost any story, I just don't think it sort of pushes us into the realms of political science fiction to imagine him being carried out in his chair out of the Oval Office. But nonetheless, who knows? The more every day that passes makes me feel like I know less about politics.
This will be our last question. Should we end up needing to go mail-in ballots, or should we have that as an option to a greater degree? Do you think it'd be largely split amongst red states and blue states, with red states not having the option and all blue states going to mail in? And if so, what do you think the fallout would be?
Well, it's a good question. I do think that there is a divide already that's formed. There was a vote in Louisiana there's in Texas as well to make sure that they don't have a system of no reason absentee voting. And I think there's an assumption that's being made on the Republican side of the aisle that's somewhat driven by President Trump, that somehow mail-in balloting will be an advantage for Democrats. And I just don't know that's really true. And I think case in point would be the election that took place in Wisconsin, where putting a lid, so to speak, on absentee balloting did not actually help the outcome of that election for Republicans. And if you look at Texas, I was looking at a case that was brought in Texas against Texas's elimination of party line voting. Texas for almost 100 years had a system where if you can just vote a party and it'll just vote for every candidate in that party. So you don't actually have to go down and look at the different candidates. I want to vote Republican. I want to vote Democrat, straight ticket voting. The Texas legislature has eliminated straight ticket voting. And what's interesting about it, and I think there's an analogy here to mail-in ballots, is one of the reasons that they're against it is because straight ticket voting used to advantage the Republican Party. It no longer does. In Harris County, where Houston is, because it has a higher minority population, because it has more Democrats, now straight ticket voting is actually becoming a slight advantage for Democrats. So, and if you think back to California, California Republicans since the 80s and 90s have been trying to get California Republicans to vote absentee. And for a while, it was an advantage for Republicans in California to make sure that Republicans had an absentee ballot because it drove up turnout. So, it's really a question of the political dynamics of the state, whether or not that will actually happen. But, there will be attempts to game because these elections are decided on the margins to try to advantage one party or the other. But I really don't think that it's quite as clear cut as Republicans think that changing the rules of the game are actually going to have the kind of electoral advantages that they imagine.
All right. Well, Professor Courser, thank you so much for your time. Everyone on the call, I appreciate you being here. I am going to unmute all, so I'll give you a minute to get prepared for that. So you can say hello, say thank you to Professor Courser directly. And of course, as I mentioned, we hope to see you on future events next week and beyond. So unmuting everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for your time. I really appreciate you coming.
Back.
The question.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. It was really great. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Others.
Thanks, Zach. Best wishes to all.
Yes.
Stay safe, guys.
Yes.
Oh, that's a pool.
Everyone, thanks for coming.
I mean, that's Claremont School, I think.
Ah.
Who's that?
Hey, Roger, how you doing?
Hi.
Tina, I didn't get to ask your question. If you stay on, maybe
Remember that campus?
Am I supposed to call you Professor Courser now? Is that a thing?
Zach is.
It's a formality for me.
Dr. Courser? What are we supposed to call you now? This is so disconcerting.
Call me what you want. Just don't call me late for dinner.
Good line.
Oh.
Okay, should I hang up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do I?
So Tina, if you want to ask Zach your question, go ahead.
Oh yeah, like I just wanted to see if you had any thoughts about how the pandemic might affect local campaigning, where door to door is more important.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a big shift towards social media, and I've seen it already, where candidates are holding virtual get-togethers, just like the presidential candidates are. There's a lot going on Facebook and through websites. And I think some of the social distancing orders are we're obviously headed to a moment where those are going to ease up, but I wonder if they're going to ease up enough to where people will actually be comfortable having candidates knocking on their doors. I think that's something that a lot of local candidates will be thinking about, is sort of like, how will this be perceived? Will it be an advantage like it usually is for me to like walk up to somebody's front door and want to shake their hand and kiss their baby and do all those sorts of things? Or will people be like, ooh, that's icky, can you stay away, please? I think it's going to be a little fraught. There may be some candidates that will play it by ear, and if things look safer into the summer, maybe they'll venture out. But I do think, just like in 1918, candidates are going to have to be innovative, and they're going to have to try to figure out different ways to approach voters that they feel comfortable with and that feel safe.
I could actually talk to this one directly, Zach, because I just had a client cancel like a decent sized contract on stuff about canvassing because they're just all the organizations are pulling that back pretty dramatically. And the local is driven largely by what happens at the national stage, so it'll be a lot less.
Yeah, no, I know. And when I say local, I really am talking like school board, city council. Yeah.
And like, the coordinated campaigns, from the national to the state, like they're all just pulling that back and switching.
But everything's so polarized. You wonder, like the Republicans will be knocking on everyone's doors and the Democrats won't. I mean, who knows?
I can see it.
I could see it too. And I don't know if that's going to be an advantage or a disadvantage because, as things stand, I don't want anyone knocking on my door.
I know.
I don't know if that's going to change anytime soon.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. We'll see.
But what else do you see in Lou in terms of, trends right now in elections?
For us, I think at the national level, money is still flowing pretty well, but I think we've seen a hit, at the non-national level and the non-targeted Senate race level. So I think there's a lot less. One of the interesting things is, kind of along the canvassing angle, field offices haven't been opened up all over, right? And so it's almost money that was budgeted will still be available later. So it's really just going to kind of alter the calculus for a lot of folks broadly. And I'm thinking like the statewide organizations, the national ones also, like they're just doing less with physical. They'll have the money to do it, but they're also inventing the stuff as they go.
Right. Yeah, I saw an invite the other day on Twitter for a Biden event, a virtual Biden event, where the minimum was $2,800.
That's me.
Was that you? And I was
that's our stuff, actually. Yes.
Well, and it's like, that's cool and all. And, if you could have a moment with Joe, even virtually, I guess that could be worth it for a lot of people. Again, you could give 10,000, 50,000 if you give them to the party and not to Joe. But I was like, you tell me, did people respond like they would have if they could have done a grin and grab and get a photo
They're still
to take
raising
home?
a buttload of money that way. And I see that literally daily. So they're, Biden's high dollar stuff is pulling in significant money still. So it'll be really interesting to see. And Biden, by his nature, was not, the Bernie Sanders, everyone gives $20, type. So I think in talking to folks on our end, where we saw it was those like $500 and $1,000 donors are the ones where you're really going to see it affecting. But like, if you could afford 10,000 before, you can still afford 10,000.
Right. And whether it's in person or over the internet, I guess you're still writing that check.
You'll still do it. You'll get your FaceTime. You don't get the picture, but
Yeah. Well, a screenshot, but
Exactly.
All right. I'm going to have to end the meeting because we have we have to use this Zoom account for a work call soon.
Yes.
Of course, you've got classes to teach and whatnot, but thank you so much.
Thanks for coming, guys. Thanks, Tina. Thanks, Lou. Thanks, everybody.
Yep. Later.
Hope you're doing well.
Bye, guys.